Okay, looks like we are live once again. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to MissionTop. MissionTop is a farmstead and ranch. It's a family, but it's also a place where we try to cultivate philosophia, which is a love of wisdom. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. For those of you that have been part of these live streams in the past, also thank you for being here. And a little bit of explanation is warranted for those that have joined us in the past. This is part of an ongoing project of mine to do a live stream basically Monday through Friday for a period of 90 days, both as a challenge to myself, a chance to get out many ideas in rough draft form that I hope to turn into many more polished video essays. And anyway, last week things were chugging along. We're getting to the last few weeks of this experiment, this project, and things kind of fell apart. I'm going to describe them that maybe they kind of fell into a black hole, as it were. On Monday, I was given this very exact stream on this topic, and midway through it, the stream failed because of my internet connection, which still is a possibility on this. So if it fails, my plan today is that I will just I'm recording this, or I actually recorded a different version of this, and I'll just upload that for today. So that's my plan. In case it fails, I won't be coming back on because it tends to be difficult to reestablish my connection once I've got going. I'm out here in rural western United States with an internet connection that's fast but not reliable. And so anyway, just a fair bit of warning on that, but it should work. I got new equipment last week, because after it failed last week, the entire connection failed for days. I had to get new equipment from my internet provider, etc. And it took a number of days, so I didn't stream all of last week. I said I was going to put some other videos up, but even after making those and going to a place to upload them, I was looking at some, I had some 40-minute videos, 45-minute videos, and at the speed of the internet connections I was finding around me, those were impossible to upload as well. So luckily, everything kind of panned out. The new equipment came. It seems to be working, and here we are. But again, just a little bit of warning that these streams aren't exactly 100% reliable. So if it does go out, I apologize. That seems to happen, rarely, but it has happened in the past. But enough about that. Let's get into the meat of why you are here if you're joining us for this topic, and that is to discuss and respond to the arguments for veganism. So I entitled this "A Rancher Responds to Arguments for Veganism," and I am a rancher. I am a new rancher, have not been doing this for too long, but I raise sheep and goats on a farmstead, on a ranch in northwestern Montana. And this week, in fact, I'm just about to harvest my first lambs, and have been preparing for that, and shortly thereafter some pigs. I was going to do it last week right after this stream, but in everything that happened last week and another sequence of events, that didn't happen, so it will be in just some coming days. So I thought it was very appropriate to give an account of why I think eating meat today is still something that is appropriate, and respond to concerns that it is not, because of course many people in the world think that it is not appropriate. And particularly one of the viewers of this stream, or listeners, a person with a profile going by LSJT in a previous stream, put out some arguments that she wanted me to consider about veganism. And so this is partly in order to carry on that conversation with her and get her responses after this. So that is why this is also happening. But the reason I think it's important to do this, and not just go by our assumptions. Some people just have the underlying feeling and assumption that eating meat's just fine. Other people have it as a core conviction that it's not. I'm a person that thinks in line with this pursuit of philosophia that an unexamined life isn't worth living, and it's becoming of us as human beings, in as much as we have these abilities to think about these things and consider them, in as much as we are valuing beings. It's becoming of us to consider our very basic processes of life, like eating, and whether we are doing them in the appropriate ways in the bigger picture of who we are as human beings and our relationship to the other living beings and the world itself around us. So that is why we are doing this. And in this pursuit, I bring this up a lot, but one of the core convictions I have about a pursuit of wisdom is that conclusion made by Socrates when he was declared wise as the oracle by the Oracle of Delphi, and he was baffled as to why he would be considered wise because he didn't think himself wise. And his conclusion was that perhaps he was wise because he knew that he was not wise, and so that's always the underlying thing I try to cultivate on these streams, is that even though I do have a conclusion, I do have, things that I do believe for the moment, or arguments that I support, I guess you could say, but I'm always reconsidering them. I don't consider myself to have all the final answers, and I'm always willing to consider new ideas, new arguments from other people, etc. Okay, so that's important to state right here at the outset. The other thing that's also important to get out there is kind of my underlying values, at least the ones that's related to something like food, because I think if you understand my underlying values, even if you don't agree with all my conclusions, you'll find that there's far more we probably do agree on than disagree. And I think it's important to do that, especially at this time of the world where so many people, find reasons to have animosity and hostility towards other people, that if we would start out by stating those things that we most care about, I think as humans we would find that, to the greater degree, almost across the board, we probably have the same concerns, the same desires. We're on the same team, as it were, in so many ways. Yes, we disagree about particulars, but if we can see those commonalities, then all these things become much less hostile. And arguments for meat or veganism are things that can become hostile. I don't think they need to be at all. And so I think we can come out of this, hopefully, even if disagreeing, with a healthy respect for why people do things the way they do in their ultimate conclusions, right? So here are those fundamental values as concerns something like food and meat. One, the first one is that I am committed to the long-term both beauty and thriving of the earth. I even see the earth and its subsystems and processes, the living things around on the earth, as kind of forming up into one grander process or system. The earth itself is a system. I would even say it's a living being. I'm kind of with that vein of thought that sees the earth itself as an organism and ourselves as part of it, right? Whether it's a conscious organism, well, that's an interesting question, and one very much worth considering. I tend to, on those kind of matters, I'm inclined to the thought that it is, but I can see arguments that it isn't. But in any case, I see myself as part of this living, breathing being or collection of systems, and I feel a responsibility to honor and care for and have a good relationship with the earth. I see it as this feminine being, and as much as the earth has always been referred to, not always, but predominantly referred to as feminine, as Mother Earth, Mother Nature, etc. And I want to have a good relationship with that being, again, of which I am a part. And so that means I'm committed to, the thriving of all the different components of that being, the animals, but everybody else, everything else surrounding the animals, the plants, the trees, the insects, the creepy crawlies, the fungi, the microbes, even the rocks and the water, etc. Personally, I'm inclined to think that all these things have a level of consciousness and different levels of consciousness, I guess you could say, with obviously more intelligent, more complex beings have more consciousness, and something like a rock less. Again, I fully realize that's debatable, especially as it concerns something like the rock, but there's theories out there that have not been disproved, that have reasonable credibility. Donald Hoffman is one pursuing these kind of theories, a serious scientist, saying that perhaps the fundamental component of everything, of reality itself, is consciousness. And I like that idea. Again, I don't have enough to say that that's fundamentally true, but it does align with a lot of people's underlying instincts, especially even in the realm of religion, where a lot of religions, including my own, have this notion that there is a spirit to everything. And another way of saying a spirit is an intelligence. Obviously, something like a rock would be something so far less, conscious, you could say, that we can't even relate to it. But perhaps it is nonetheless. Whereas something like a cat, there's something we can understand a bit, its consciousness. Of course, it has such a different framework, but at the same time, we're both mammals. We both, eat meat, for example. These kind of commonalities, as we look at the cat, as mysterious as cats can be, as some of you that have cats may know, you have at least some sense of that consciousness that might be there with the cat, where it's harder with other things. Anyway, that's all an aside to say that when I look out into the world and participate it, I take all levels of it very seriously. I think there is, I respect life, obviously, of course, more than things that seem to be less conscious, less inert, like a rock. But at the same time, I see something like a plant dying. I take that seriously. It's at some level of life or consciousness, even in its dissolution, there's a death there. And I take that seriously. I imagine there's got to be some sort of trauma, probably not like ours with the nervous system and whatnot, but some sort of trauma to a plant as well when it dies. And so you got to respect that, even while recognizing that as part of this complex organism and interconnection of systems that's all around us, death and pain are a regular part of life. So I also don't see those things as bad things necessarily. And that will be important to, the considerations of whether eating meat is appropriate or not. Okay, so as part of that, an important thing to stress on this is that if the earth is this living, breathing being, or at least is composed by all these different other subsystems and definitely living things around us, especially the animals that seem to command, our attention most of all, we've got to see ourselves as a part of this living being. So in as much as I'm seeking the welfare of all these other things, the animals and the plants and etc., I'm part of that as well. So my welfare counts as well, and the welfare of humanity. Sometimes we look to remove humanity as if humanity is this other thing. And some people even go as far as kind of like that thought in the Matrix that they see humanity as a cancer or a virus on the planet. And I don't see things that way at all, that we're part of these systems around us. We're part of this greater living being of the earth. And so our needs and welfare matters in this. But of course, I also think, in consideration of everything else, we shouldn't consider our needs as justification to make everything else or anything else really worse off in the process. Our participation in the earth and its systems around us should only enhance things around us, and that's at the core of my values, at least. And then at the end of the day, it's also important to recognize that we are different from everything else we see around us in this system, in as much as we are valuing beings as humans. We have this ability to value, to produce moral decisions, to see things as good or bad. And in as much as we are doing that, it's becoming of us to look at something again, like, is it right or wrong to eat meat? Is it a value, a higher value to not eat it, or a value to eat it? And so it's becoming of us to make these kinds of values and considerations, and to value the other things, all the different components that go into that. And then lastly, I want you to know that rather than just kind of sitting by and thinking about this stuff in some ivory tower or something like that, I consider it a great value to dive in and live out your values in this. And so it's not enough for me to hold a position, let's say, saying like that, I think, eating meat is bad, but then just kind of go along with the system and eat it just like everybody else, accepting whatever the industrial system gives me. I see that as a bad thing. Or, I guess what I'm trying to say at the end of the day is that in all this, in the whole consideration of things, I'm I see it as important to dive into the process, to participate in it, to produce meat, for yourself, and see these things for yourself, to grow food for yourself. I find a great value in that. And in that, then, also comes out the greater ability to change along the way, to change your opinions about things, because I think it's that participative level of living in the world that is probably the most important level, right? Where all other things that come out of our participation in the world, our perspective on something, the procedures that we use to get what we want, and then finally our propositions, our facts that we produce, all kind of stem out of our participation primarily in the world. And so I find it is, at the end of the day, we need to be willing, any of us that have opinions on things, to really dive in and participate in this process of food. Okay, so those are my underlying values, and again, I hope that they're valuable in as much as whatever conclusions I make, you find something in there that says, okay, yeah, I can respect that those values are decent values, hopefully, and the way that you're trying to pursue things is a reasonable pursuit of those values. And so even if you disagree with me, you can at least respect that much. So let's dive in to the basic arguments for veganism and then start responding to them, in as much as that's the topic that we're addressing today. And so what I did is I went online and just kind of looked for, to begin with, the most kind of succinct version of the argument for veganism. And I'm going to respond to that, both succinct and powerful. I didn't look for some straw man argument to topple. And then, again, like I said, a member of the audience of this channel, it goes by LSJT, has put forward to me, sent me by email, additional considerations that I also want to respond to, and both to carry on a conversation with her, but also because they're additional points beyond just the basic argument for veganism that I found. So we'll start with this basic argument, which has just a few components to it. One, we shouldn't be cruel to animals unnecessarily. Okay. Two, the consumption of animal products harms animals, causes their suffering, in ways that they wouldn't experience outside of human control. Okay. Three, the consumption of animal products is unnecessary. Therefore, four, we shouldn't consume animal products. And so, again, I see that as pretty tight, succinct version of an argument for veganism. And so now we'll go through and respond to those before jumping into the ones from LSJT, the considerations from LSJT. So, jumping back to this, we shouldn't be cruel to animals unnecessarily. So on this, I am agreed, by and large, right? That there is, because animals are one of these more complex consciousnesses, and there seems to be a natural ethic that comes out of our participation in the world, and that's that the more complex consciousnesses become, or the more intelligence we see in something, the more self-awareness we see in something, the more evidence of some form of consciousness we see in something, the more respect we generally give to that thing. And that's why it's very natural to us to afford more respect and care, as it were, consideration, as it were, for something like an animal, rather than something like a blade of grass, which most of us, some of us may care deeply about that blade of grass, but almost across the board, it's going to be less than an animal, right? And so, in as much as we see so many of these animals having attributes of ourselves, we understand them, we can see consciousness, we feel like we shouldn't be cruel to them unnecessarily. But of course, we have to consider what it is to be cruel. So I agree, we shouldn't be cruel to them. But we have to define what's cruel. And probably the key point is that, as opposed to maybe somebody that might be more inclined to veganism, I don't see the pain or death of an animal as being innately cruel, right? Of course, the devil's in the details, but I don't see an animal suffering some pain at some points of its life to a reasonable degree, or when it dies, as being cruel to animals. And I don't see it, anything dying as also being inordinately cruel. And that's because those things are part of life regardless, right, in the world. And as much as we look out and we see how systems, living systems operate, both pain and death are a normal part of the experience of things in the world, especially those things that we most can relate to, such as animals. And so again, I don't see it as wrong for animals to die, and I don't see it wrong for there to be pain involved in the process. But we'll get into what I do see it wrong is for an animal to suffer, more than it would in the regular course of a life, out there in its existence, untouched by humans, as it were. And that gets into, what is suffering as opposed to just, the regular pain of an animal. What amounts to kind of a suffering or cruelty. That's where we get. Let's get to that in this next point. That the consumption of animals. Products harms animals, causes their suffering in ways that they wouldn't experience outside of human control. So here's where we get really to the crux of the matter, that in the way that we interact with animals, we cause an inordinate amount of suffering that rises to the level of cruelty. So it's more than they would experience just living out in the world, and we're the cause of it for our own well-being, right? They're, in essence, worse off in many ways. Whether it's a painful suffering or maybe it's a more prolonged suffering, such as being a chicken inside of a small cage for all of its life. Regardless, it rises to the level of cruelty by our eating their animal products, and therefore our consumption of animal products causes cruelty and suffering in animals, right? And so on this one, again, I am agreed by and large, right? That this is the world that we live in. This is what we have done to our system of producing animal products for ourselves. So by and large, 90%, 95% of the industrial food system does in fact accord to this principle of the vegan argument, that our consumption of animal products does harm animals. And the reason for that is that of course, chickens is probably one of the easiest things for us to see this in. The ways that we can, just recently confined them in small cages for all their lives, just with no way to actually live out any sort of their regular patterns of behavior. The feed that we give them, the way that they've been genetically modified in ways that, a chicken that produces meat so fast it topples over, it can't even walk. All these things. That's one of the easiest ways to see how we've kind of abused this process, created a level of an unideal life in an animal that is, very regrettable, I would say. The same thing happens, I think, in our feedlots, the way that we produce beef. Most beef, as I look around, starts out with a pretty good life. I'm here in, again, northwestern Montana, where I think the beef process for a lot of beef begins, and that's out in a green grassy field, eating the grass. I see that, just a couple hundred yards away from me. That's taking place all through the summer, and even in the winter, these animals are eating, in a lot of places, predominantly hay and things like that. But it's when they get passed on to the feedlot process, where they're in this concentrated feedlot, being fattened on grain, basically with not a speck of grass around, the thing that they're meant to live in, and just basically living in their manure in confined spaces, etc. And then the stress of moving into the slaughter process, that's where things get pretty ugly with beef as well. Okay, so by and large, I'm agreed on this principle, but the crucial point as to where I arrive on meat is that it doesn't have to be this way. Okay, so I don't think it is inherently the case that producing animal products has to result in the pain and suffering animals that rises to the level of cruelty. And so, that's basically the argument that I'm going to make here, and that's what we're trying to accomplish at MissionTop. So the primary ways that we're raising meat is that we are running sheep and goats in a rotational grazing system, where every day they move to a new place of pasture. I wish there was enough that we could do that all through the winter, but we do arise to a place where we have to start feeding them hay, and that's all we feed them is a blend of hay, so something that's just been harvested from fields that we look to have not have any chemicals at all bound up with it, and that's what we feed them from the winter. Still moving them around so they have fresh things. There is a little bit of forage they can get in the winter, they don't live in confinement. We are breeding them so that they lamb around this time of the year where conditions are good for lambing, etc. And then they have one bad day where, in essence, a predator, which would be us, ends their life in a harvesting or slaughter process. Okay, so that's that. We have pigs going as well, which we will both move around. We will keep them in confinement sometimes, but kind of let them root around in a paddock through all sorts of organic matter into a paddock that they seem to really enjoy rooting around in. If once we've satisfied with an area being done with that, we'll move them to another place. So we have pigs being raised in that way, giving them all sorts of food that we would eat. The remainder of foods that we would eat in as much as they're omnivores. And then we're raising chickens through what I'm sure most of you have probably seen, through kind of chicken tractor methods, where they again get moved around from place to place, get to do their regular behaviors of scratching and pecking the earth and eating bugs and all those things in a way that they are in a confined space, but they get moved every day, have enough space to move around amongst them. They have fresh air because they're confined within this kind of box, essentially this large kind of 8 foot by 8 foot rectangular box, but over a new piece of ground, and the walls are just chicken wire, so it's fresh air flowing. So, just to show you like our efforts that we're going through to give these animals a good life. And another thing to consider is these are all domesticated animals, right? And that's one thing we have to consider in terms of the well-being of an animal being raised for meat or animal products. We, as part of this living system, humans, we have altered these animals in ways that I think their regular satisfaction in life, their well-being, is now tied up with humanity. These are not the wild animals they were thousands of years ago, before humans domesticated. Now we've changed their very nature, such that I think their contentment, such as these sheep and the goats, is just fine to be in a moving paddock every day. They don't expect or want or desire anything else. Can I be sure of that? No, but it's important to realize that us, as part of the natural system, we've involved ourselves to the point where we change beings in ways, and those beings are in some way now have a symbiotic relationship with humans. I think dogs are the best example. I mean, dogs are not wolves anymore. Of course, they have a lot of connection to wolves, but they are not wolves anymore. And they are very much satisfied and see themselves bound up with the lives of humans. They like humans. That's why I like dogs as a pet in the way they are, because they do see their lives and their satisfaction and their happiness as bound up with humans and doing work for humans. You see them, many dogs are most happy doing some sort of job for humans, and they both like serving their master and doing their job. And I almost see it as the abuse when you take those sporting dogs, or these dogs meant to do a specific job, put them into the city in a situation where they're not able to do that job. I see that as a bit abusive. But anyway, I'm just trying to make this point here that the animals that are generally bound up with animal products now have been turned into very different animals than their wild counterparts, which their satisfaction probably is being not bound up with humans. And of course, you can argue that we've gone too far in many ways, again, genetically modified things in ways that are just not that seem wrong, again, like the chickens that raise meat so quickly that they topple over and things like that. And I of course agree with that, but when you look at a lot of these breeds, a lot of these heritage breeds and things like that that have been around humans for quite some time, you don't get that same sense that their life in a good relationship with a farmer or a rancher is in any case a life of suffering. Okay, so and in fact, at least I observe, I try to see, do they have a sense of well-being in as much as I understand it, and I try to alter things so that they maintain that sense of well-being, right? there's always question marks around all this, right? Is a chicken in a state of suffering by constantly laying eggs? Because probably out in nature, they wouldn't be doing that. It'd only be a certain time of year, and it does seem to be painful to a chicken to lay an egg, just like a birthing process. And so I'm asking myself that kind of question. How much when does it approach suffering for a cow to produce milk for humans? In as much as maybe a cow only has one calf and has extra milk, and you're during that regular process of calving, you're taking some of the cow's milk. That doesn't seem to produce a lot of suffering. But if you're trying to keep this cow, eking out every bit of milk while trying to breed it and all these things, and you're seeing this cow waste away, of course, that seems like it. There's different ways that we can abuse, dairy cows in that process. So I'm always asking myself those questions, and it's not like I have total concrete answers on a lot of them. I'm trying to, again, observe, practice these things, and try to feel out what is right and what is wrong. Okay, so that was all part of that second part of the argument. The consumption of animal products harms animals. So my response would be, in essence, I agree by and large, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I am pursuing things in ways, I wouldn't be satisfied if I felt like my animals were suffering because of me, right? All right, so next, the consumption of animal products is unnecessary. And this one, again, I would agree on that basic tenet by itself. Humans are versatile omnivores, and we can eat a variety of things, and we can live without animal products. That is the case. But my crucial thing, again, is that I don't see it as a bad thing to consume animal products. Or consume animals. I don't see eating another thing as a bad thing. In as much as, again, I look out at the world and living systems, and everything in essence dies at a certain point. Sometimes young in its cycle, sometimes old in its cycle, and everything is eaten in one way or another. If not by a predator, then by the very processes of the earth as well. And in some part of those processes, there is pain involved in that, right? Whether something is getting eaten by a predator or whether something dies of old age and sickness, there's going to be a pain involved with that as well. So that's where I get to the thing where, even though I think it's not necessary for humans to eat animals, I don't see it as a bad thing either, in as much as this is the way that reality presents itself to us on this earth, and that value that a vegan might put in, that things shouldn't die, things shouldn't eat each other. I guess you'd have to apply that to all the other omnivores and carnivores that are out there. You'd prefer that a bear only eat, berries and grains and things like that, and not other animals. Like, again, you can throw in that value, but I don't agree that you should. If some people do that, I don't see it as a bad thing for things to eat other things. The one exception to that, of course, would be humans, and maybe I'll get to that if it seems like we have time. That's worth considering, why there would be a difference as to humans, whereas I'm okay with everything else being consumed. But just, one more thing to consider with that. In that process of eating, there's always in the natural systems this process that things that get eaten get incorporated into other parts of the system, you could say, as it were. That plant that I'm eating, its matter, its cells, its energy are now incorporated into my body. It becomes part of me. And the same thing with an animal. And again, there's something that is a dissolution, a death as part of that, but there's also a rebirth, a life. And that's, those two things right there are part of, I think, reality at its core. It has a creation, a cycle of creation, and then a cycle of dissolution, and then a cycle of recreation, where things, all things become part of new things as well. Again, I don't want that to sound too new agey. I'm just trying to describe what actually happens out there, whether you look at it in a scientific sense, spiritual sense, etc. In as much as I've had some of you on here, one thing I should have pointed out, you're welcome to comment as part of this. So if you want to get in some questions, counter arguments, whatever, please participate in the chat. Either my chat's broken or nobody's commented thus far. So I just want to make sure that people are aware that they can. Always happy if you just want to say hello as well. Lets me know who's on here, if there's regular people that have been on here before. So yeah, please do that, and we'll get to, I'll read every bit of the chat, in as much as there's never a tremendous amount of people on here yet, and so we can get to your comments, questions, etc. You're welcome to participate. So anyway, we'll get to the last part of this. Actually, before we do that, we're going to get to this last part, which is the conclusion. Thus, we shouldn't consume animal products, which, of course, I'm not going to be there as much on. But let's back up again to the consumption of animal products is unnecessary. One more thing I wanted to say on that, in that notion that, I don't see the pain and suffering involved with the death or the consumption of an animal as a problematic thing, in as much as it's part of the way that life works, including our own lives. And one more point I would put out to that is that in something, I think a lot of times we look at certain kinds of animals in the wrong way through our human eyes, even through like this particular cultural moment of history. So we're in a very individualistic culture, where the primary component of culture we see as the individual, by and large, right? But when you look at something like a flock of sheep, I don't think they understand themselves that way. I think the more important organism is the sheep itself, is the flock itself, right? And so this is going to be kind of an important part of why I think certain ways of harvesting meat are okay, because in as much as I think the way as I observe these sheep interact with each other and see how they understand each other, the way that they feel incomplete not being part of the flock, they're traumatized just by being away from the flock, for instance. The more that I kind of wonder, how do they even have any sense of individuality to them at all, or do they see themselves, more as part of this grander thing? If that's the case, then taking part of that greater body, you could say, in a way that preserves the body, in a way that body, that flock, is able to regenerate itself and prosper in things, again, is not nearly as bad of a thing as when we think of ourselves as individuals, like eliminating a human individual, and that individual consciousness that has this total self-awareness and stuff. It's a very different thing. So that's why, again, just one more part of why, especially with these group and flock animals, which are predominantly the animals that are used for meat, I don't see it as a problem to or see it much less of a problem to remove parts of that organism, the flock or the herd, while preserving the greater flock or herd. Okay, so basically, if we go through that basic argument again, when we shouldn't be cruel to animals unnecessarily, basically totally agree. But I don't see death and pain as part of being cruel to animals. The consumption of animal products harms animals, causes their suffering in ways that they wouldn't experience outside of human control. I do agree with that by and large, and I lament that I have participated in that life, and as much as I've consumed many pounds of animal products that have been produced that way, and have to live up to the fact that I've participated in that, but I'm trying to get out of it, right? I think there are ways to do it without that. And because of that, then the next part, the consumption of animal products is unnecessary. I agree with that, but in as much as I don't see it as problematic, I disagree with the final conclusion that is that, in as much as the basic argument is we shouldn't consume animal products, I see the consumption of animal products as non-problematic, if that didn't come through clear, that it's okay, that there's even, that it can even be done in a way, and that's what I'm pursuing, in a way that actually makes all the other parts of the world better, ourselves, the plants and the animals, etc. And that's one thing I should add in about some of these better and better understandings we've had of things like rotational grazing. The argument is that by running especially these really efficient ruminant animals like sheep and goats over pastures, over silvopastures, which are forested places, it's not only good for those animals that get fed, it's only good for us that harvest some of their meat, it's actually good for the environments themselves, if done in the right way. That if you graze things to the right levels, you don't, graze every blade of grass down to its last little nub, but you leave enough of it, and you do it in a way, again, of this process of a little bit of death administered on a place, that there's actually a greater rebirth of life and flourishing in that place if done right. And of course, it's a tricky business because you got to do it right. But that's important in there, because the way that I want to raise meat is a way in which everything benefits. All the other components of the earth, by and large, benefit. So that should be thrown in there. So anyway, that all goes to why I see it as non-problematic. Those aren't the only considerations, though. So let's get into the other reasons that LSJT gave and sent me by email that I should be considering, because they're good things to consider. And by the way, even in all this argument, like I'm not gonna make the argument that you have to eat meat either. Like, I'm totally fine with people that don't want to eat it, and there are ways of doing it. I think that they're like that, or that you can live healthily and whatnot. So I'm not going to argue the other thing too, that you must do it and you're bad if you don't either. Okay, but here's the additional reasons. And yeah, thanks Ratha and Chase and Sean for all saying hi. Glad you could be here as part of this. And yeah, any other comments or questions, always welcome. So the first thing that she points out is that eating meat is unsustainable and polluting, and we can produce much more food in less space by raising plants than raising meat. And she even adds in an argument that hunting even damages the ecosystem, even though there's been arguments to the contrary. And so, again, by and large, I agree with this already. I'm a person that probably ever since reading Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma back there in the early 2000s, have been thinking about this, and think that all of us should be thinking about this. That in so many ways, yeah, the way that we raise meat typically is unsustainable and polluting, especially, not in a lot of ways, not a lot of the kind that's just raised on some small farm, but of course that is not the kind of meat most people are eating. Ironically, even many of the farmers themselves, are buying the stuff in the supermarket, and that almost has always gone through this industrial system that is unsustainable and polluting in many ways. It takes sections of the earth and leaves them worse off for having raised animals there. The way that pork is raised in the United States, for example, that creates these great destructive pools of manure as part of those operations, where pigs again are raised in these very confined settings just over concrete, and just not allowed to be a pig at all. But yeah, it's not just bad for the animals themselves, but the ecosystem around that suffers. Feedlots have done the same thing. And so yeah, there's a very good argument to be made that that's damaging, and you can produce a lot more food from just raising plants and not even considering meat in as much as we don't need meat. So again, I see those all as possibilities, but I just return to this thing that it's not necessarily true. And there's the best argument is that there are ways of raising meat, and I'm trying to participate in them, that actually do make the environment better. And in as much as that's the case, so here's one thing to really consider, and this is the argument that comes out from Alan Savory and his book Holistic Management, but really it's a whole body of thinking now. His argument is that there are certain environments in the world that actually need ruminant animals to participate on them, or they won't flourish as well. Okay, and so he calls these brittle environments. These are the environments of the world that are a little more arid. Okay, so like the United States West is a very good example of one of these brittle environments. Places in Africa, or large sections of Africa, are these more brittle environments. And the characteristic is that when plant matter grows and then dies, it doesn't, absent some other force, it doesn't easily decay and return back to be soil as part of the earth. And so I see this every day all around me on our farmstead, and it's something we're always thinking about, because you'll see that if something, certain types of grass have grown up and then become dry in the dry season, and they haven't been eaten by something, they actually stay there, and they stay there for years. Okay, they don't break down very easily in a dry environment. They oxidize, they turn dry and brittle. Nothing wants to eat them, and then since there's not the moisture in the environment to have the fungi and the decomposing processes happening easily, what happens is year after year those things start building up on the the layer of the soil, to the point that new things can't grow because they're blocking the sunlight. Okay, so Alan Savory makes the argument that by removing animals from these types of environments, and that's what a lot of like national parks have done over the last century and things like that. When you take out the ruminant animals, especially, that help to decompose these things, because they eat it, they process it in their ruminants, and then they put it out in a way that is easily returnable to soil, right? By taking those out of the environments actually desertify. They become more desert-like. And so that is a very fascinating argument, right? So, basically he's trying to show, and he's lived it now. Like, he is a scientist, and now he's tried to, over years and years, show that when you bring in herd grazing animals, of which there used to be the bison in the American plains and huge herds of animals in Africa and stuff, when you bring those in and eat things down to an appropriate level, then there's actually a greater flourishing of the soil, of the plant matter. More carbon is ultimately sequestered down into the soil, and it's better for the entire environment. So, thinking that way, there's actually a thing where, you need these ruminant animals. They will grow up, they will produce these herds, and then as part of that, in as much as we are meat eaters as humans, it's appropriate to eat part of those herds. And that is exactly what I'm going to be doing this week. I've had this herd, and they have been going around, again, trying to participate in this process of eliminating all this dead matter that is on my property. Like, there's thick dead matter from in places that have not had anything eating. They eat that down now, and hopefully things will improve. And I'm going to harvest some of that meat along the way, in as much as I am an omnivore, a meat-eating animal, and everything benefits, right? So that's where, again, as far as Sarah's thing, I'm going back to this thing that I agree, by and large, our industrial system, by and large, fits exactly this, but there are places for meat in there that actually improve everything and are needed, you could say. Okay. So next, another point is that slaughterhouses are inhumane for animals and workers. Okay. And real quick, I noticed, Rotha says a lot of land is non-arable land, not suitable for crops, but fine for grazing ruminants. Yeah, and that's another point. And here's another thing too, is that it's worth considering that just raising crops in the way that we've been doing, certainly with the industrial agriculture, but even going back to agriculture since it's been existing, in around our first cities and civilizations, there's at least an argument worth considering in the book *Sapiens* by Yuval Harari. I think is Yuval Noah Harari. I think that's his full name, where he makes the case that human quality of life has actually gone down in the way that we have turned to our especially monoculture agriculture, right? And so even to the vegan argument, there are problems also with just raising food in kind of our monoculture agricultural setting. And so, like Rotha brings up, there are settings in which the best thing you could do with the land would be to appropriately raise meat on it. Now, I'm not to the point where I think that we're going to get rid of all agriculture and things like that. Obviously, we have we now have to learn to do it appropriately, because we do need the food yields that has and whatnot. But I just point that out to show that there can be huge problems with agriculture in raising just plants as well in that. And so anyway, and it's worth pointing out, with that even under the vegan argument, if you're producing those crops and in the regular agricultural process, insects, animals, etc., microbes, so many things will die as part of that process as well. Again, which I'm not seeing as bad. It's just that no matter how we eat, whether we're eating just plants or we're eating animals, there is death of other things, including animals involved, even if we're just eating plants. I don't see that as problematic, but it's something where if that's like the main argument that death inherently is bad, of course you could say, well, less animals will die by eating vegan. Okay. But again, I think the better point is that things dying as part of other animals eating in the world is just not problematic, period, if that makes any sense. Okay, but the main argument here is that slaughterhouses are inhumane for animals and workers. And once again, from what I know of slaughterhouses, I'm largely going to agree. The one thing that it's really tough to think of animals when they go to the slaughtering process is that they've lived, oftentimes they've been born and lived their entire life in a setting, which oftentimes is a very good setting on a small farm or something like that, where they've lived, hopefully been given a good life, and that's become their home, the place that they feel secure in and safe and whatnot. And then when it comes to slaughter time, the way that we've made to do it in our industrial system, which has a bunch of roadblocks for doing it other ways. Anyway, you load them up into a vehicle, and then you ship them off to this facility where, especially the bigger the facility gets, it's got to be a stressful environment. It would be a stressful environment for humans because it's utterly foreign from where they've been. There's a lot of concrete and tiles and tiles on the walls or fencing and channels and things like that, where it's got to be inherently stressful, and then in that process, of course, they're slaughtered and whatnot. And so I would agree in the basic argument that probably that whole process of doing that is much less humane than a different way, which I'm going to describe, the way that I'm planning on slaughtering or harvesting my own animals. Okay. I think there's been a lot of effort made to make slaughterhouses and things more humane and whatnot, trying to, listen to animal advocates where the actual process of killing the animal, whether it's through these guns that, have basically a stunning blow or an instant blow to the head that knocks them unconscious or things like that. I know there's probably been processes where there's been inordinate amounts of suffering in the animals, but also, you've got to recognize there's been efforts made to probably make these slaughterhouses, such that at least that killing portion does dispatch the animal quite quickly. But again, I'm just saying that in the context that, yes, I agree by and large, the slaughterhouses, the very act of taking an animal there has an inhumane part to it, right? And then you have the workers themselves, where to me, just the very nature of a factory, which a slaughterhouse becomes, and that repetitive nature of just things coming down a conveyor line is also, in my mind, not the most humane thing. So I'd have to agree with that as well. And I think there's a better way of doing it, which is, so here's my slaughter process, and here's how I think animals could be harvested or slaughtered. So, again, my sheep and goats, up until the very moment that they die, are going to be in the exact same place that they've always been. So with my sheep and goats, the only real tool that's going to be used in killing them, in slaughtering them, is a very, very sharp knife. And so, in these coming couple of days, I was hoping to do it last week, but it's going to be in these couple coming days. In these couple coming days, I'm going to go out there to the paddock, get one of these lambs, probably take it just out of view of the others, as I've heard that sheep don't care too much to see their own, die or things like that. But goats actually get a little bit suspicious of you to see you killing other parts of the flock, and there are goats there. So I might take that lamb just out of view. It's very easy to subdue a lamb or a sheep in certain ways in which they become completely submissive and don't fight. So you have it there on the ground. You kind of crank their neck in a certain way, and you make one very quick and decisive slice of its throat down back to its spinal cord, and in the course severing its bigger arteries there, and it bleeds out. And as I understand it, the actual death, the unconsciousness, you could say, of that animal happens very rapidly as the blood pressure leaves its brain. So will it involve pain for that animal? I'm sure it probably will. Will it be traumatic to a certain degree? Yes, I'm sure it probably will. But will it be more traumatic than that animal dying as just of a sickness of old age or being killed by a predator? If anything, it will be less traumatic than that, I think. And so, that is the way that animal will be slaughtered. And then I'll take it into my care in order to skin it and ultimately eviscerate it, take out its organs, and then you have the carcass and you're using its meat, including many of the organs itself. Okay, so that's how it would happen with sheep and goats. With pigs, it will be just a little bit different. I'll go out there with a 22 Magnum rifle and a jacketed hollow point or a full metal jacket round, and we'll be very patient in waiting till I have a very good shot of the pig's forehead, right there, kind of a little bit above its eyes and in the center of its forehead, because that's right behind that is its brain, about the size of a golf ball. And so, take a shot that, if done right, will go directly into their brain, and that pig, dies within seconds. Right there, you'll also go in and you'll stick the pig, again, cutting its arteries, usually collecting the blood if you're using it for culinary purposes or just allowing it to bleed out. Pigs aren't as traumatized by seeing other pigs die right next to them. They, in fact, show no signs of any sort of trauma. And so that's how I'll dispatch a pig as well. I'm sure at some point in doing this, I'll miss, and then I'll have a very mad, wounded pig, which I'll have to probably go in there and with a knife try to dispatch as quickly as I could. Which, again, all these things, I'm not saying I'm going to enjoy this, that it's pleasant, that the animal won't suffer. But even in that, if I missed this shot on a pig and had to go in with a knife and kill it myself, I don't think it would be any worse than the sickness that pig would go through when it dies of old age, or if it was killed by some sort of predator out into the wild. So I don't have a moral problem with the kind of slaughter that I'll do. The cow is also done with a 22 bullet in the very same way, and then chickens will be done where you put them down into a kind of a metal cone with their heads out, and you cut off their heads immediately that way. So that's the way that I'll dispatch chickens. But everything, in the most peaceful process possible, both for the humanity of it all, but also to be humane to these animals, to cause the least amount of suffering, but also because the more stressed they are, the worse their meat actually ends up. And again, as much as I see human benefits as part of the grander system of the earth, that's also a consideration. I don't want their meat to taste bad from the stress, chemicals and hormones and things that go through when an animal is stressed prior to its death. So that's how I will do it. And I actually think that there's something so much more humane about that than definitely like just buying my meat at the store, where I have no connection to the fact that this was a living, breathing animal. One that has, despite what I said about being part of a flock, these animals do have individual personalities. Different ones of these animals have endeared themselves more to us than others, in as much as, they behave in different ways. They have personalities. Some really seem to like you in different ways, even as humans. Right. And so, I, in a sense, I see it as more humane to face up to that fact that that's what you're doing to an animal, is you are killing it, rather than just go to the store and take the meat off of the shelf, if that makes any sense. One things that I have to ask myself in this process is it inhumane to kill animals young, right? Because a lot of people prefer lamb meat rather than older sheep meat, which is called mutton. And so you're killing them sometime prior to a year, and sometimes much younger than that. Chickens, if you're raising them for meat, you're oftentimes killing within a few months, 3 to 4 months. A lot of times cows live a little bit longer in order to get to that full, beef weight. But of course there's veal that happens, and there's and most cows are only living a couple of years or a few years, whereas their full life cycle would be more like 20 or beyond as far as how long they could live. And so is it wrong to kill animals before they've lived a full life cycle. And that's something worth considering, right? And my answer to that, probably would lie more into that flock herd thing, where I'm seeing maybe the better way of looking at the entity of what a cow or a sheep is more a flock of cows or a flock of sheep. And also consider that in the natural processes itself, it's very common, very normal for many young organisms to die, in the process of a herd, living or something like that. You can imagine that the whole strategy of a herd out in the wild is that many things will die, but the herd will live, and so even when they're fleeing from a predator, they bunch all together because the predator will get some of them, but not other them. And guess who they usually get? They usually get the babies and whatnot. And that's why, there's somewhat of a strategy through most of these beings and living, that it's just kind of a regular part of nature that younger things will get picked off, many of them, right? You can see birds definitely have a lot of that kind of strategy as well and how they live. So again, as I try to ask myself is it inhumane for me to pick off a lot of the younger animals to eat? It's something I weigh, but there's also, it's something that I see out in natural processes that leads me to say that it's not an inherently moral issue of killing young animals like that. But of course, it's all a matter of degree. For example, a lot of male chickens, when they're just chicks, are immediately thrown down a chute. If you've ever seen the movie Baraka or something like that, there's a sequence that shows, birds just looking at chicks for their sex in some sort of kind of factory-like facility, and all the males are just thrown down a chute where they're going to be ground up into like animal feed or just in the trash or something, and so they're just, there go chick after chick down this chute. And there's something about that bugs me, right? They're not even being used for anything, and there is just kind of this reckless, lack of care for the elimination of life in that setting. And so it's all a matter of degree, but as of yet, I'm not too troubled by the fact of just killing animals young. I also think that there's reasons to let animals live longer. We think all the meat's better, younger and more tender, but it turns out there's arguments to the contrary, both for beef and for sheep as well. So I'm excited to kind of explore that side of it, the culinary aspect of things, which again, as much as humans are part of the system, I don't see it as wrong to disregard, human culinary preferences in all this as well. Okay, just one or two more points. But it looks like Ratha, you've been saying some things, so let's make sure to address that. You say a lot of land. Okay, organic farming needs manure too. They aren't allowed to use chemical fertilizers. And so, so going back to the previous things of just talking about how, if you're going to farm organic, if you're going to raise things in that way, that at least is definitely better than a lot of industrial, ways. Of course, organic farming is very industrial in a lot of its ways too. But in any case, in order to produce a lot of the food we need, fertilizer is one of the best things from animals. I think a vegan would say, well, you don't necessarily need to kill that animal as well. And so, you have to consider that. But again, my thing goes back to, I don't see it as a problem to be harvesting or killing part of those animals that produce manure as well. So it's a good point to bring up, Ratha. And it says, have you killed an animal that you've raised before? We have, so there's been animals that have died, a few of them, a few lambs along the way, a few of our chicks and whatnot. So I have not, as of yet, myself, slaughtered an animal. There was like a chicken, one of our dogs accidentally got wounded, one of our chickens almost to the point of death, that we had to then, kill ourselves to, in essence, to hasten its death because it was on its way out. So, we've done things like that. And definitely when you get out here onto raising your own things, death is just part of you become a lot more accustomed to it, let's just say, because it's happening out here. And so I think that even though it will be difficult, I don't think it will be overly difficult. I will be interested because, of course, with this first batch of lambs, a lot of my kids have named them. They know them very well, and we are going to be harvesting those animals. And so I'll be interested to see how they act. And that's that's another thing I'll give some commentary on, especially after the fact, but even before the fact, is I've tried to explore how kids approach this. It seems like even younger kids that have relationships with animals, it's a less troubling thing. They kind of have to learn to be troubled by death. But my older kids, I think, will be a little bit more troubled by their death. But it's actually a kind of trouble that I want them to have to deal with, in as much as this would be the case with any of the meat that we eat. Animals would be dying, and I think it's a better thing for them to have to face up to that, and know that animal that they cared for. I want them to care for the animals. I don't think they'll probably name all the animals from this point out. That's just kind of a natural thing right here at the beginning. But I want them to have that kind of care for the animals, and then be willing to say, like, I'm killing you and I'm eating you. I'm incorporating you as part of me now, and I've dissolved you in a sense. I've introduced death to you and your parts, but there is something that eating has been tied up with sacred ritual and things like that from time immemorial. So there's something that should be very meaningful and sacred about the process of eating as well. Let's see, you also bring up, he says, I haven't either, something I want to face, but I imagine it would be very difficult. You haven't hunted either. I'm more likely to do that than raise animals. And that's where hunting is a whole different animal, but a whole different related topic, which has very good arguments for it. Again, LSJT has made the argument that perhaps even hunting isn't as environmentally friendly as some people claim it is, and she didn't give specific arguments for me to address, but I imagine that's probably the case. I imagine there's a lot of ways in which hunting could be environmentally done wrong, and then there's probably ways that hunting could be done right. And so I think the answer is, I don't have a problem with hunting per se, in as much as it fits within the whole rest of this argument. But if we're going to do it, we should care about what kind of impact it's having, even to the course of, the impact on the land, the impact of vehicles used to get people out there. And as much as a lot of people use a lot of vehicles these days that might, tear things up in different places and whatnot, that we, stick to better, to wisely chosen roads and things like that, and impact the land in the least amount possible. And then in the way that the herds are managed of animals that are allowed to be hunted, of course there's going to be a way that it could be done foolishly. There's going to be a way that it could be done in a sense of care for everything else. And so my argument would be, hunting's it could go either way. Let's do it the right way, right? And yeah, I want to get more into hunting as well. Just not something that I've ever had the time to develop the skills on. All right, so I think we've addressed quite a bit of things at this point. Let me make sure if there was anything else that that LSJT had brought up. Oh, she had also brought up that methods of raising meat with the hormones, the antibiotics goes into it, is harmful both to the animals and the humans. Again, I would agree with that. I disagree. I'm against our industrial food system. Even though I recognize that I have, participated in it in the past just by, eating the stuff off the food shelf. So I'm not saying I'm innocent of it. And so I would agree that that's harmful to animals, which is why I'm not going to do it with our animals. To this point, I have not given our animals anything. No treatments, no antibiotics, no deworming, and that's going to be the goal. When such specific situations come up, then I'll have to make those kind of decisions with deworming, for instance, if it's clear that animals have gotten parasites or something. But my whole goal and the kind of animals I've gotten are ones that I hope are adapted to this place. I've tried to get ones that don't have to be wormed, and certainly ones that don't need antibiotics or things. And so that's going to be the goal of these animals, is to have minimal impact. But of course, if something is sick or injured, in much as I have a sense of with these domestic animals that I need to care for them, I'll have to make those decisions of what I would do in order to care for them, right? Okay. And so, yeah, I think that's basically addressed the main vegan argument that I've found in my response to it, these additional points that LSJT has brought up and responded to those. Again, all with a sense of respect for people to disagree on these things or see different nuance. I should say one thing is, and this goes kind of maybe a final point that we should bring up, like, why would you be fine with inflicting death on all those other things, especially animals that you're caring for and you see personality in, but you think that's okay, but you wouldn't be okay inflicting death on a human being, as much as everybody pretty much recognizes that's wrong. We're not even go into that argument, unless they're attacking you or something like that, self-defense. But what's the difference there? And that's where I can recognize right off the bat that people might draw lines in different places. So I completely respect that somebody might say, I don't see enough consciousness, let's say, that I have a problem eating plants or fungi or even certain types of animals, maybe mollusks or something like that. But when I look at animals and these things that seem to have personalities and some sense of individuality, maybe most of them don't have a sense of awareness that rises to the level of like being able to look in a mirror and know that it's them that they're looking for. I think only some primates have that ability. But anyway, some people say, I don't feel comfortable, inflicting death on an animal that has that level of consciousness. I can respect that, right? Even though I draw the line somewhere different, because that's my basic argument of why you wouldn't eat a human or why you wouldn't harm a human, is because a human has several degrees of magnitude higher levels of self-awareness, of agency, you could say, of ability to reason, of intelligence. And all these things call out to us and say, respect that, allow that, do not compel that, right? In ways that are still there to a degree with animals, especially the more complex and intelligent an animal that we see, such as a dog, such as a dolphin or something, the more we say, yeah, we shouldn't, you're inclined less to either compel those things, to mistreat them, or to eat them. Well, yeah, humans are just the most complex thing we know, the most self-aware. They can express to much greater degrees who they see themselves to be, the fact that they don't see it as appropriate for themselves to be extinguished, that kind of thing. So, of course, those are the basics of why, when I look at humanity, the answer is obvious. I should not kill, and I should definitely not eat, human beings. And you could get into, well, what about after a person dies? Why don't we eat them just as a matter of, efficiency or something? And that's a kind of a whole different matter of the way that we perceive ourselves and cannibalism stuff. I don't want to get into that. The main thing I want to say is, like, yeah, it is the case that humans are the most complex being we can clearly demonstrate and prove in the world, as compared to all of the other things that we can see, and they are more levels of magnitude higher than that, above any other animals that we see, and so that's why I draw my line there, between humans and all the other animals. Although it would be very difficult for me to like kill and eat my dogs. It would be much more difficult than my sheep. I probably would eat my dogs if it was a matter of survival in the end of my survival, but it would be more difficult than my sheep, and it's less difficult for me the less intelligence that I see in an animal. So that's the basic kind of argument of why not humans, essentially, and why a lot of this, at the end of the day, this is where we'll end, goes down to the level of what is consciousness and how does it arise. And how are beings composed? Like, in as much as we've talked a lot about on this channel, is that I don't see myself as one undivisible thing. I see myself as kind of a collection of personalities, spirits that generally answers to the name of Gary Nuila, and I am a conflicted self composed of many different things, and yet I arise to a conscious state like I have and that I hope you have. Of course, we never know for sure other people are conscious, but we presume they are. And anyway, my point on all of that is that that's at the heart of why I respect humans more, as it goes down to the nature of my consciousness as compared to what I think the nature of a a pig's consciousness is. And so things might change the more that we understand what consciousness is, the more that we understand if there are several different conscious levels of ourselves that exist and that compose up into, that join up into this higher consciousness. That matters in as much as we look back at animals and whatnot. And anyway, the point I'm trying to make there to end this up is that, to me, the fundamental factor that will influence my decision in the future as to whether I continue to eat meat or see anything that I eat, plants or whatnot, as different, will be the development of our understanding of consciousness itself, and whether things as simple as plants have consciousness, and to what degree, and whether even things like rocks and stuff do, and how those might be able to join up into more complex consciousnesses that we see in animals and whatnot. And as much as we better understand that, we better understand what level of respect to afford each of those levels of consciousness, and better understand ourselves as well. So it's important to throw in that one, it so much depends on our understanding of consciousness, and two, we still have much that we do not understand and can't account for with consciousness. And so it's something that I think everyone should pay attention to. Okay, but I think that was a pretty good accounting for today. I'm interested. It doesn't look like LSJT was able to be here, and I kind of feel bad because I didn't tell her that I was going to jump and do it in today. And so I look forward to her responses to this, which if warranted, we could do another episode on this. Thank you for your participation. I hope this was useful and gave you something to think about, whether you agreed with me or not. And I will continue streaming now. So basically with my 90-day project, I'm going to kind of count last week as not existing, since it kind of turned into a black hole week, and just kind of add one more week onto the basic time, which gives me, I think, about this week plus 2 more of this live streaming. Lastly, for anyone interested, I've been saying for the last couple of weeks, I'm like this close to being done with the video essay Interstellar. And last week, with all the stuff that happened, I made a lot of progress, but it is still not done, and it's turned out to be a beast. It's clocking in a little over 50 minutes. I still have to put clips to about 8 minutes left, and then I've got to do music. And just, I think with this one, with it being so much and the way that I've sat on it for so long, I've got to make sure it's really good. So I might kind of sit on it for a little bit just to make sure I feel good that it's the quality that I want it to be before putting it out. So I've stopped saying when I'm going to put it out because, I don't know, but it is reasonably close to being done. And I'll be glad to finally knock that out because it's turned into kind of, about 4 videos in one. And from here on out, I'm going to be looking at much shorter videos. So that's close, and hopefully it will be worth the wait. Otherwise, the streams will be happening on the other days this week. Thank you again for joining me, and always glad to have you along. Tomorrow we'll be talking a little bit more about generations. And as much as I've been reading this book, The Fourth Turning, which I cannot believe I had not encountered until now. I did a stream about it 2 weeks ago, but it has just been fascinating. It introduced so many useful ideas to understand, to make sense of the world right now, and make sense a little bit of what might be coming in the next few years. So I look very much forward to talking about that tomorrow, and we will see you back then. This is Gary signing off from MissionTop, and hope you have a great rest of your day.